Andy Stanley begins his book titled How to Be Rich. That's a great title, right? I recommend the book. He tells a fascinating true story from the history of medical breakthroughs. Now, let me say at the beginning, this is a lengthy story, much longer than I normally tell, but I want you to hang with me through it, okay? Because I believe the payoff and where we want to go today is worth it. So hang with me. He writes, by the time they brought the patient to him, the situation looked grave. Miss A, as she was called in medical journals, was visibly stricken, and her motor skills had been reduced to semi-controlled trembles, the telltale movements of someone nearing the end. In the confusing mix of symptoms, her family suspected tuberculosis or a blood disease. She looked less like a treatable patient and more like a discarded cadaver from behind the town hospice. Her cheeks were sunken. Her skin was like cheesecloth draped over a fossil. The notion that this doctor could save her was a long shot. You see, in 1866, there were no CAT scans or MRIs or tests to determine blood counts or endocrine levels. The practice of medicine was little more than a catalog of barbaric experiments. Common techniques at the time included bloodletting, opium injections, electric shock, and turpentine enemas. These grotesque procedures were often the final nail in the coffin for someone already weakened by fever or infection. But Miss A had been brought to Sir William Gall, and he wasn't like other doctors of his era. He valued observation over action. He was slow to treat and quick to care. While he was credited with numerous medical breakthroughs, his greatest skill was his keen bedside manner. We treat people, not diseases, he would often remind his students. Fools and savages explain, wise men investigate, was another one of his favorite sayings. So whenever he wasn't sure, he resorted to basic nursing duties while he continued to observe. Only by immersing himself in the patient's experience did Dr. Gall manage to discover what others overlooked. The case of Miss A was to be a perfect example of this dedication. For 2 years, he oversaw her care, methodically nursing her back to full health with a regimen of remedies. Little by little, her strength returned, and little by little, Dr. Gall gathered the certainty he needed to declare a name for the disease that had almost taken Miss A's life. After careful consideration, he dubbed it anorexia nervosa. That's right, anorexia. Sir William Gall had discovered one of the most puzzling diseases of the 20th century more than 100 years before its time. He gave it the name that still haunts headlines today, and he successfully treated dozens of cases, reversing the devastation and returning them to normal life. And Gall meticulously documented the details of each one, and with each case, he deepened our understanding of this crippling disease that offered virtually no clinical factors that a medical staff could treat. You see, anorexia was one of the first psychological diseases spawned by modern industrialized culture, and it has become one of its most enduring. Anorexia is among a class of diseases that attacks the body despite the fact that it exists only in the hidden recesses of the brain. It's an invisible invader wreaking an all too visible havoc. It's not just a foreign agent like a virus or a bacteria or a cancerous cell. It is a sinister deception that hijacks the mind and programs it to destroy its own host organism. Dr. Gall's remarkable diagnosis makes perfect sense looking backward. Anorexia was a byproduct of the social pressures of the day. Throughout the 1800s, civilizations were slowly shifting from their agrarian foundations or farming. Cities were growing bigger and bigger. Cultures were being consolidated as people shared the same buildings and read the same newspapers. Social norms were established on a scale like never seen before, and lifestyle magazines began to blanket communities propagating unwritten codes of conduct for rules of conformity. For the first time in history, it was possible to take any idea and to begin to promote it on a massive graphic scale. The age of the mega peddler had begun. And thanks to industrialization, everything was bigger too. Basic goods became enormous industries. News sources became mass media, and large factories churned out products. The age of needs-based marketing was gone. To move the massive supply of goods being manufactured, industries needed to manufacture an equally massive level of demand. And one of the concepts they began to promote was the ideal body image. Corsets were in style. Fashion was imperative. And the importance of having an hourglass figure was emphasized for women everywhere. Now, if you've looked at art in history, particularly back in Middle Ages, certainly before 1800s, the ideal body image was anything but thin. It was plump and shapely. But the corset took things in a whole new direction, literally. To accentuate that full-figured look that everyone wanted, the lace-up corset was designed to shrink the waist, giving the appearance of fullness everywhere else. It was mostly an optical illusion at first, but the custom evolved into a trend that brought some very real ramifications. To keep up with the Joneses, women began drawing their corsets tighter, and then Mrs. Jones would tighten hers again. And over time, a woman could push things around and train her midsection to achieve enormous reductions in her waist. At its peak, the standard for an attractive waist was anything under 20 inches. By the way, corsets are making a comeback today disguised as ab trainers. But to paraphrase Shakespeare, a corset by any other name would be as uncomfortable. It was not uncommon for a woman's waist to be 16 to 18 inches after months of training. Many women learned to breathe using only the top portion of their lungs, which caused mucus to fill their lower lungs and left them with a persistent cough. You won't hear about that in the infomercial. The health implications of corsets were debated rigorously. It was a hot topic in the day, the same way gun control or the deficit is argued today. It even had a name. It was called the corset controversy. The newspapers were filled with editorials arguing both sides. The volume of op-ed submissions on this topic hit its highest point in 1860, about the time Miss A began to struggle. While opponents called the corset a form of oppression, many of its staunchest supporters were the women who wore them. There's not a single fashionable woman who does not wear a corset, one woman wrote to an editor. Another said, "Go without my stays," another name for corsets. Never. I wouldn't do anything so untidy. I think a woman without corsets is most unsightly. You cannot look smart and have a pretty figure without stays, she writes. It is impossible. Under the weight of this social pressure, Miss A considered the implications of being fashionable versus being comfortable. And perhaps, like numerous others, she concluded that the risk of not measuring up to society's definition of acceptable beauty standards was too great. A common myth about anorexics holds that when they look in the mirror, they see a fat person. And that's not really accurate. What they see is someone who would be better off just a little bit thinner. For Miss A, it probably meant she needed to tighten up her corset another inch or more, a goal she had accomplished several times over. But when she returned to look in the mirror, she got the same feedback each time, just a little bit more. And at some point for Miss A, her pursuit of the ideal body image became an irrational, immeasurable, and unattainable pursuit. You know, there's something about living in a civilized, industrialized culture that compromises rational thought. Agrarian people didn't seem to wrestle with it as much. You know, it's easier to keep your priorities in perspective when they revolve around the tangible elements of survival, like where your next meal is coming from. But the richer you get, the more your priorities begin to separate from actual needs. You see, when all of our basic requirements are met, our appetites for progress don't turn off. We simply turn from the things we need to the things we want, and that's when we enter the world of the subjective, because wants are harder to define and easier to confuse. In America today, there are more than 8 million cases of anorexia. Think about that. At a time when we enjoy the most abundant food supply in the history of the world, the number of people voluntarily starving themselves to death continues to rise. And it's no secret that our culture's emphasis on body image plays a huge role in that, proving once again, friends, that the human mind is a powerful yet fragile thing. The irony for anorexics is that they've already mastered the thing they're working so hard to achieve, which is they're really good at losing weight, they're really bad at knowing when to stop. They're so absorbed in the effort to get thin, they no longer recognize when they are thin. Friends, anorexics aren't the only ones adrift in the world of the subjective. Our civilized, industrialized culture invites the rest of us to compromise rational thought in another way, in a tangible way. Not only does it encourage us to be thin, it also encourages us to be rich. And the richer we become as a nation, the more our priorities seem to separate from what are true needs. Our basic requirements having long since been met, but our appetites for progress are not turned off. And when we look in the mirror, we see an altered version of what's really there. We're so absorbed in the effort to get rich, we no longer recognize when we are rich. The truth I want to tell you today is, friends, we're already rich. We're already rich. No matter where you stand today on the state of our economy, we live in the richest time, in the richest nation in history. For example, in our Western culture today, most of us observe a 5-day work week. Most of us do. You work 5 days a week. Think about what that means. Most people have to work only 5 days in order to have 7 days worth of food, shelter, clothing, and health care. We take it for granted. In fact, we've practically established it as a right. But that's unique to our little window in history, and it's still not the case everywhere around the world. What's more, there are households of 3, 4, or more people that send only one person out into the workplace to earn money. And with that one person's earnings, the entire family can amass enough money in 5 days to give them all food and shelter for 7 days. In many cultures, this is inconceivable. Outside of work, if you work a 5-day work week, that leaves at least 50 hours for pure discretionary time use. Most people in the world can only imagine such luxuries. And I know what you're thinking. Pastor, those examples don't really prove I'm rich. Maybe they serve to convince me I'm not poor by the rest of the world's standards, but my hunch is you're richer than you realize. It just doesn't feel like it. So let me give you a few more scenarios to consider. If I told you today I was going to offer you a job with a starting salary of $37,000 a year, would you feel rich? Now, some of you might, but most of you wouldn't. Chances are most of you wouldn't even be interested. I mean, a salary of $37,000 a year represents a pay cut for most Americans. But for 96% of the world's population, $37,000 a year would be a significant increase. Maybe there was a time in your life when that sounded like a lot of money to you, and it should. In fact, if you earn more than $37,000 a year, you're among the top 4% of wage earners in the world. Congratulations, you're in the 4% club. You're rich. On the world scale, you should have no problems at all, other than a handful of rich person's problems. Problems that the majority of people on this planet would love to have. Bad cell phone coverage or plan. Rich people problem. Can't decide where to go on vacation. Rich people problem. Computer crashed, slow internet, car trouble, flight delays, Amazon doesn't have your size. Amazon Prime doesn't offer overnight shipping on your product. Can't find a reliable pool person. Space Mountain shut down because of weather when you're finally at the front of the line. And I know some of you Disney aficionados are saying, hey, wait a minute, Space Mountain is an indoor ride. I speak from experience on this. When it's lightning outside, they shut it all down. That happened to me and my family, and I'm not bitter. All rich people problems. Next time there's a watering ban in your neighborhood, just remember that many people, and mostly women at that, carry jugs on their heads for hundreds of yards just so they can have water for cooking and drinking. They can't imagine a place where there's so much extra water that house after house just lets it spray all over the ground. Andy Stanley makes a statement that you may roll your eyes at, but hear it out. Financially speaking, he says the difference between you and Bill Gates is smaller than the difference between you and the average person living outside the U.S. To most people, your bank accounts look virtually the same. Stanley says that years ago, Bill Gates traveled to India on a philanthropic visit in a neighborhood outside a large city. He spent some time talking with an Indian woman inside her hut. Through a translator, they discussed the state of health care and other needs of her people. After he left, there was a journalistic party following them around. And a journalist asked the woman, did you realize the richest man in the world was just in your house, unfazed? She remarked, everybody who visits from the West is rich. In her eyes, the average American is so rich, she views them all the same. Feeling guilty? I hope not. That's not the purpose of what I'm telling you today. On the contrary, I'm hoping over the next couple of weekends, particularly leading up to Thanksgiving, you will feel grateful. Guilt rarely results in positive behavior. But friends, great things flow from a heart of gratitude. Gratitude is the antidote to keep us from living with a spirit of pride or a spirit of poverty. You say, what do you mean by that? One guy wrote this, when you think about your situation in life, pride says, I deserve more. Poverty says, I should feel guilty. Gratitude says, thank you, Lord. When someone says you have a nice house, pride says, we're going to build a bigger one. Poverty says, it was a foreclosure. Gratitude says, thank you, the Lord has blessed us. When someone says, that's a great suit, pride says, it's tailor-made. Poverty says, I got it half price. Gratitude says, thank you. When someone says, that's a nice car, pride says, I got 3 of them. Poverty says, it's a company car. Gratitude says, thank you. You see, pride wants people to think you paid more. Poverty wants people to think you paid less. Gratitude doesn't care what people think. It only cares what God thinks, who gave it all to us in the first place. Right? Now, while we're considering and while we're comparing on this, what we call poverty today would have been considered middle class just a few generations ago. In 2000, the average poor family, as is defined by government standards, had goods and services rivaling middle-class families of the 1970s. For example, in 2000, those who qualified to be considered poor families, 60% had microwaves, 50% had air conditioners, 93% had colored televisions, and 60% had video recorders. As a kid growing up in the 70s, I can tell you, that's rich people stuff. Melinda and I got married in 1983. Someone offered to video record our wedding. They said, yeah, hey, you know, you don't have to do those reel to reel. They got these tapes now. And you can tape your wedding on video. I scoffed at them. I said, I'll never be able to afford to buy a VCR. Isn't it good to know that the church is led by such a visionary thinker? I have owned and disposed of multiple VCRs in the past 32 years. Some of them still flashing 12. because I never could figure out how to set the time on those things. You know why I've been able to buy and sell several VCRs? Because I'm rich. And so are you. Gallup conducted a poll to see how different socioeconomic groups defined rich. Not surprisingly, everybody had a different definition, and nobody thought he or she fitted. For instance, for every person in the poll, rich was considered double the amount of whatever they possessed by the person defining it. I explained that poorly, but let me give you an example. When they interviewed people who made $30,000 a year, that group defined someone as rich who earns $60,000. When they interviewed people who earned $50,000 a year, the magic number was $100,000. That's a rich person. In the same vein, Money Magazine asked its readers how much money it would take to make them feel rich. And according to the average reader of Money Magazine, a person would need $5 million in liquid assets to be considered rich. Now, based on the trend found in the Gallup poll, the readers of Money Magazine probably averaged a $2.5 million net worth, half of their definition of rich. I guarantee you, if you ask someone who has $5 million in liquid assets to define rich, they'll probably say anyone's got 10 million. And on it goes. Two takeaways from those surveys. Number one, rich is the other guy, not me. Rich is that other family, never us. Most people are rich, don't know it, don't feel like it, don't act like it. Number two, rich is a moving target. No matter how much money we have or make, we will probably never consider ourselves rich. The biggest challenge facing rich people is that they've lost their ability to recognize when they're rich, silly rich people. How many of you remember this, what I'm about to put on the screen here, from a psych class or sociology course? You remember that? What's that called? Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Dr. Abraham Maslow used a pyramid to explain a phenomenon that all of us have experienced. In essence, here's what he said. Our needs are always changing depending on our circumstances. His model starts at the bottom with what we would call basic needs, or as he calls them there, physiological. And it progresses all the way up to the very top that amounts to luxuries, at least for the people who haven't acquired them yet. So here's the dilemma. As Maslow's model suggests, no matter where we are on this pyramid, we always want something more. For example, when we're hungry and thirsty, more is simply food and water. Physiological. That's understandable. But once you graduate to being fed and hydrated, more becomes basic safety and security. That's reasonable too. Once you're convinced the borders are safe and there's peace in the land, more shifts again, and your emotional needs become the focus. And things like love and acceptance and a sense of belonging that perhaps hadn't occurred to you when you were hungry, or if it did, you didn't consume a lot of energy with it. But once we possess those things, we find ourselves longing for achievement or a sense of purpose, what Maslow identified as self-actualization, his clinical term. But it merely represents the highest level of more. By instinct, we are oriented in the direction of progress, and there's no rest from this perpetual drive. We find ourselves wanting more within each of Maslow's stages too. Even when a food source is found, it's just a matter of time before people begin to look for ways to improve it. No matter how good we've got it, we always manage to entertain the idea that we might be able to do just a little better. If you've ever shopped for a car, if you've ever sold a house, if you've ever traded stocks, if you've ever chosen a date for the prom, you can relate. Melinda and I have been blessed to sell several houses over the course of our marriage. As we moved from Mississippi to Kentucky, where we bought our first house, and we bought another house in Kentucky, and then we moved to Ohio, and we bought a house, we moved there, and we sold it. And we bought another house there, and we sold it, and we moved here, and we bought a house here, and we sold it, and last year we bought another house. I'm very grateful when I make this statement to you. No house we owned ever sat on the market longer than a month. And most sold within days. We had 2 houses that sold the day we listed it. Every time that happened, someone invariably said, "Pastor, you priced it too low." you could have made more. You could have made more. No matter where you are on your Maslowian journey, the tendency to think about what's in front of you and you care less about what's behind you. Friends, that's human nature. As long as you're heading up the pyramid, you will focus always on what you don't have and less on what you do have. Only when something unexpected or tragic or shocking happens that turns us in the other direction do we look back and realize we had it good all along. The purpose of these messages over the next couple of weekends in our Live to Give series is to help rich Jesus followers get better at being rich. Even if you're not convinced you're rich, you probably hope to be. One guy was asked if he'd rather be rich and miserable or broke and happy. He replied, "I'd like to be semi-rich and moderately depressed." And I am talking today to a lot of semi-rich and moderately depressed people. That's a fact. But should you ever admit that you have in fact crossed that imaginary boundary of being rich, you need to be prepared, because there's a basic principle at stake that Jesus taught about those of us who have more than others. Read this out loud with me. Would you read out loud with me? This from Luke 12:48. Here we go. Let's read it out loud. From everyone who has been given much, much will be demanded, and from the one who's been entrusted with much, much more will be asked. I want you to underline those two words, much more. Now, Jesus made that statement at the end of a parable about a manager of an estate who was put in charge while the owner of the estate is away. He is responsible to see that the other servants are fed, resourced, and that the household runs efficiently. That's the job of the manager. He manages on behalf or in place of the owner. Some translations call this person a steward, but the steward in Jesus' story here decides to use his master's absence as a license to live in luxury and indulge himself while ignoring or even mistreating the people he was responsible for in the household. He mistakenly thought that more meant more for him. Jesus concludes the story with a sober warning that not only did the steward lose his job, he suffered greatly because he mishandled his opportunity to manage more. Then Jesus said those words that we just read aloud, and for emphasis' sake, here they come again. Let's read them out loud one more time. Here we go. From everyone who has been given much, much will be demanded, and from the one who's been entrusted with much, much more will be asked. You see, most people who have more are not very good at managing more. And somehow that always seems to surprise us. We assume that rich people are smart people. Otherwise, they wouldn't be so rich, right? So when we meet people who are richer than us, we often conclude that they're smarter than us too. When they join the conversation, we listen more carefully, we give extra weight to their opinions, and we defer to their preferences. But listen to me, richer doesn't mean smarter. For example, when people get rich suddenly, they almost always are never good at it. A lot of professional athletes get rich suddenly, and they're terrible at it. According to Sports Illustrated, listen to this. This blew me away when I read this. An amazing 78% of NFL players, and by the way, they're making more than $37,000 a year. 78% of NFL players find themselves bankrupt or financially stressed within 2 years of retirement, and 60% of NBA players are broke within 5 years of walking off the court. How could that be? Here's what you're thinking to yourself right now. If I were in their place, I would never let that happen. But it's not just athletes. One study of lottery winners showed that nearly half had spent their entire winnings within 5 years. 5 years. Friends, having lots of money doesn't make you good at being rich any more than having lots of children makes you good at parenting. It just means you know how to produce. Possessing wealth doesn't make you good at managing wealth. And while some people are bad at keeping their money, just about all of them are bad at being generous with it. Studies show that the richer people get, the smaller the percentage of money they give away. We talked a lot about that last week. We won't go into that again. The point is, most people who are rich are not good at being rich, And as you know, there's a plethora of books that teach people how to get rich, but statistically, I don't believe that's our problem. On a global scale, we're already rich. What we need are instructions on how to be rich so that many of us will be able to help manage our more well. Solomon was arguably the richest man in the history of the world. I think you can make that case. Solomon was arguably the richest man in the world. And he makes a series of insightful statements in his unconventional autobiography named Ecclesiastes. That's what Ecclesiastes is, by the way. The book of Ecclesiastes is Solomon's autobiography. It's just a little weird. And he talks about the realities of managing more. Every verse that we're going to read in Ecclesiastes chapter 5 yields a great truth about the hazards of not understanding how to be rich. Take a look at this. The italicized is the verse, and the bold italicized is the statement about the verse that we're making. Whoever loves money never has enough money, so the more you have, the more you want. Whoever loves wealth is never satisfied with his income. The more you have, the less you're satisfied. As goods increase, so do those who consume them. The more you have, the more people will come after it. And what benefit are they to the owner except to feast his eyes on them? The more you have, the more you realize it does you no good. The sleep of a laborer is sweet, whether he eats little or much, but the abundance of a rich man permits him no sleep. The more you have, the more you have to worry about. I've seen a grievous evil under the sun, wealth hoarded to the harm of its owner. The more you have, the more you can hurt yourself by holding on to it. Or wealth lost through some misfortune. The more you have to lose. Naked a man comes from his mother's womb, and as he comes, so he departs. He takes nothing from his labor that he can carry in his hand. The more you have, the more you leave behind. As the wealthiest man on earth, Solomon learned affluence didn't satisfy. In fact, the Bible suggests that possession of great riches can almost be a spiritual liability. That's why one guy, upon meeting a man with great wealth, he said to him, I'm going to pray for you and your problem. And the wealthy man arrogantly said, what problem are you speaking of? He said, my friend, you have been afflicted with affluence. On one occasion, Jesus was teaching a huge crowd that gathered around him. Someone yelled out, Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me. Seizing upon the man's request, Jesus turned to the crowd and said, watch out, be on your guard against all kinds of greed. A man's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions. And Jesus went on to amplify his warning on the consuming nature of greed by telling a story about a rich man whose fields produced a bumper crop. Upon seeing his unprecedented, unexpected, increased in prosperity, the man thought to himself, what should I do? What shall I do? By the way, that's a very good question. That's a very insightful question. That's a question I believe God wants us to ask ourselves often when we think about how to manage our more. There's nothing wrong with the question, what should I do when it comes to managing money? So far, so good. But the answer the man comes up with is terribly misguided. Look at the personal pronouns here. This is what I'll do. I'll tear down my barns and build bigger ones, and there I will store all my grain and my goods, and I'll say to myself, you have plenty of good things laid up for many years. Take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry. Bad answer, wrong conclusion. Because no sooner had he said that than something totally unexpected, totally unaccounted for happened. He died. And Jesus explained it, and God said to him, you fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? As his listeners absorbed the impact of the story, Jesus said, if you don't get it, here's the application. This is how it will be with anyone who stores up things for himself, but is not rich toward God. What does it mean to be rich toward God? That's what we want to talk about next weekend, but I want to give you a few summary statements to think about as we close. Being rich toward God, this is not in your notes, just listen. Being rich toward God means growing a soul that is increasingly healthy and good. Being rich toward God means loving and enjoying the people around you. Being rich toward God means learning about your gifts and passions and doing work to help improve the world. Being rich toward God means being generous with your stuff. And most importantly, being rich toward God means making that which is temporary become the servant of that which is eternal. Now, here's what I know. You've looked at all this stuff up here on this table beside me and you thought, what in the world is he going to do with that, right? Some of you have been worried he's not getting to this. So I want to help you a little bit, okay? We're going to close here. Everybody get a red and a blue sticker on your way in. You get a red and a blue sticker on the way in? Bring it out. This is a time to red and blue sticker. You remember the old movie, The Matrix? Red pill, blue pill? And you took the blue pill and you woke up and everything was the same. You took the red pill, you go in a rabbit hole and you see a whole new reality, right? Well, we're kind of reversing that today. Red stands for temporary. Everybody say that with me right now. Temporary. Say it real loud. Temporary. Blue stands for eternal. Say it real loud. Eternal. All right, so here we go. We've got some items up here that a lot of us value. We've got an iPhone right here. All those things are very valuable right now. You know what that is? Say it out loud when I put the sticker on. All right, we got an iPad. That's even more valuable, right? Hang on, let me put the sticker on it. Here we go. Temporary, right? That's temporary. We've got a nice little Mustang GT here with the racing stripes, huh? That's a sweet little baby right there. But you know what that is? Say it. We got a McMansion right here. I mean, this baby is loaded, tricked out. What is that right now? Temporary. And we know what this is, right? The checkbook. We got a checkbook. You know, that is very temporary. Put a red dot on that one, baby. That's overdrawn right there. Okay. We got a Rolex right here, right? Not kidding. This is my watch. I don't have a Rolex. But my wife got it for me. It's very good, but still, it is temporary. This drill represents a job or work. And what's our job and all the tools that go with that? Say it. And we got a can of Vienna sausage right here representing food. We should put a blue sticker on this because these babies are eternal right here. We found this in the building when it was built back here. But we're going to mark the food supply as temporary. We've got some nice little clothing right here, a little girl's dress right here. What is this? Temporary. Yeah, let's just throw that down there. And this is my 3-wood. And if I don't start hitting it quick, it's going to be temporary real soon. We're going to put that baby in timeout in the garage. But it is temporary. All right? Can I ask you, young man, would you just come to the front of the stage right here? Come right here. Just come right here. It's okay. You don't need your shoe because it's temporary. Shoes are temporary, son. Turn just around right here. See this blue sticker right here? I'm going to put this right. Do you mind if I put that right there? And what that means about this young man right here, he's eternal. He's eternal. Thank you, young man. I appreciate that. Now, here's my point. Never let the red dot become more important than the blue dot. So today when you go home, maybe when you leave right now, on your wallet, put a red dot. Put a red dot on your house. Put a red dot on your computer somewhere. Put a red dot on the car dash somewhere. But on you or someone you love, I want you to put your blue dot. You put your blue dot. Because you are designed to live forever. And never let the red dots, temporary, ever become more important than the blue dots. That's why the theme of the Promise campaign was this. The promise is for you and your children, and for those who are far off, for all whom the Lord our God will call. We never want the red dots to ever become more important than the blue dots. Amen? Let's stand together right now. Let's stand. Lord, I want to be rich toward you. Forgive me, Lord, for just wanting to be rich. That desire is no different than the dead, rich fool's desire that Jesus told about in his story. Lord, I don't want to just be rich. I want to be rich toward you. Thank you, Jesus, for showing me, for showing us what that means. Would you shape my attitudes toward money and possessions so they align with yours? In the name of the one who was rich, yet for my sake he became poor, even Jesus, we pray. Amen.